In one of the most well-known moments in all of American cinema, a character who had famously become more machine than man leans over to a defeated foe and presses him to give in. Darth Vader says to Luke Skywalker, "You are beaten, join me, and I will complete your training," to which the now reeling and bleeding Luke Skywalker says, "I will never join you. You killed my father." And Vader says, "No, I am your father." To which Luke responds famously, "No!" And what is called in contemporary cinematographic circles the big no is a trope that has been used to great effect in a whole litany of films, but is drawn from the world of literature and can be traced all the way back to the Bible. When Hagar and her son are expelled from her husband's tent and meander despondently in the desert, v'tisad kola v'tefk, she raised her voice and she wept. When Esau felt fleeced by his brother's scheme to receive their father's legacy, v'yisai Esav et kolo vayevk, Esau raised his voice and wept. When Yaakov kissed his cousin and understood that love makes us vulnerable to loss, v'yisai et kolo vayevk, he lifted his voice and he cried. Skipping from the age of the patriarchs to the age of the prophets, we read of our still unsettled nation being told of heaven's displeasure, and when they heard that they had forfeited their protection, v'yis'u ha'am et kolam, the people raised their voice, v'yivku, and they cried. And this pattern of vocal sobbing, of big no's, persists into the age of kings in the context of both the heads of the house of Saul and the Davidic line, where in a fit of narcissistic paranoia, Shaul hounded and pestered his successor, but came to his senses, compelled by the young David to see that he was not a threat. V'yisa Shaul kolo vayevk, Saul raised his voice and cried. And a decade later, King David stood at the side of a grave of an assassinated advisor who had been slain as retaliation for killing one of his cousins. V'yisa hamelech et kolo vayevk, and the king raised his voice and wept. And the sound of these raucous cries resonates through the pages of scripture, where Job's friends try to understand his loss, and Ruth and Naomi process their grief, both lifting their voices and weeping. Heart-rending cries pierced the skies and fill our minds with intimations of pain, which brings us to the pinnacle of our parsha, where a small crowd of scouts return from their quest and provoke a bout of national dread, having informed the people that the land was unconquerable, filled with cities that were impregnable and a geography that was insurmountable and enemies who were unbeatable. We are told, "V'tisa kol ha'ida v'yitnu et kolam." The congregation raised and gave their voice, "V'yivku ha'am balayla hahu," and the people cried that night. But what we are told here breaks the mold that we've seen everywhere else. If this is simply another one of the Bible's big no's, like Eov's or Shaul's or Naomi's or Yaakov's, the text should have said, "V'tisa kol ha'ida et kolam v'yivku." The congregation raised their voices and wept. But it doesn't say that. It does not say, "and the people raised their voices and wept." It says, "V'tisa kol ha'ida v'yitnu et kolam." The congregation raised and gave their voice. V'yivku ha'am, and the people cried. So while the scouts were loud, they didn't weep. The weeping, it seems, was for the people. So this is our question. What does it mean that the scouts gave their voice? In every other case, voices are raised in pain, but here they are given in a way that leads others to cry. In the words of one commentator, "Hakol eino nitan," a voice cannot be given. Ma v'yitnu, what does it mean that these scouts gave their voice? And there are two answers to this question that I'd like to share with you today. First, for Rav Hirsch, this is not an exception to the rule of the biblical big nose, but is its zenith. To give voice for Rav Hirsch is to be overcome by pain in a way that supersedes the ordinary laws of weeping. In his words, Nitnu laza'aka, lihimashech below ma'atzor, their voices were given to screaming and keep screaming ceaselessly. So overwrought, so tense and distraught were the Meraglim that their thoughts were emptied by pain and replaced by the wail of a soaring misery. We are to imagine that night in the sands of the Sinai as witness to the worst feelings ever felt by our people, who heard a primal scream unlike any other in our history and then wept themselves in turn. This moment was for Rav Hirsch the biggest of the Bible's big no's. But there is another view that sees this not as a big no, but a big show, that sees the scouts as completely calm, but keenly aware that to succeed in upsetting their mission, they needed to distress the rest of the people. And for the commentators who take this view, the scouts are in this moment profoundly deceptive, merely acting tormented before the entire assembly with the intention of provoking a nationwide dread. The scouts in this moment are the epitome of inauthenticity and pretense as they stage a fraudulent performance intent on upsetting the divine plan. And for at least one of these readers, that is exactly what is meant when our verse says that the congregation, the Eidah, gave voice. The scouts manipulated the people with sound. Hayu matchilim benigun hakina. They began with a melody of lamentation. Vahayu mosrim lahem hachein vahanigun kedei livkot. And they used that melody and produced that emotion to induce the tears of despair. Sometimes words can fall flat, but sound possesses an insurmountable power that can pierce our defenses and shape our perspective and prompt a whole range of responses from relief and peace to disquiet and fear. In fact, so adept at this oral elicitation have composers become that scores of songs and soundtracks are now laced with patches of what is called infrasound, which is noise comprised of sound waves which have a frequency below the limit of human audibility, but not beyond our sensory register, which simply put means that our minds can sense the sound even though we cannot hear it. And if you've ever found yourself shivering or on edge in a movie when nothing has happened yet, it may well be because your mind is reacting to orally undetectable infrasound. Music can move us in ways that words alone often cannot, and the scouts knew about sound's profound power, so they began their report with the melody of lamentation to activate a wave of nationwide grief. Though they knew that their march into the land would be unimpeded, these scouts needed the people to cry and complain so that they could maintain their status in the desert. These were the princes who had power and influence, but no responsibility, because the nation was fed and protected and led by heaven, and the idea that these princes would become responsible for guiding an economy and training a military and taming a free society made 10 of them nervous and uneasy. So v'tisa kol ha'ida v'yitnu et kolam, the congregation of scouts raised up and gave voice with a melody of lamentation, v'yivku ha'am, balayla hahu, which made the people cry through the night. And we live in an age where sound often eclipses sense, where facts are shrouded in feeling and simple truths are concealed beneath schemes to draw our attention and make us real. It is hard to turn on the news and not see a banner in bold in all caps implying that the end is nigh. There is much profit to be made in provoking panic and passion and anger, much revenue to generate through fear and terror and dread, much celebrity to be merited through indignant protestations and persistent proclamations of an apocalyptic politics. We are surrounded by sounds that seek to shape our lives and stir our tempers. We are like the people in the face of the spies trying to sift sense from the sound and resist the power of a confounding effort to drive us into a frenzy. So as we all pray, may we all find ways to deepen our faith, to buttress our devotion to truth in the face of feeling, and resist efforts to provoke us into a rage and leave us reeling. And may we all not only resist the sounds that seek to confound and divide us, but come together to produce a melody that induces harmony and inspires hope. Shavua Tov.